Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the afternoon sessions of day 2 of the Culturally Competent Conversations for Equity and Belongingness Summit, or the C3EB Summit. Before I introduce my speaker and give you his bio and let him take it away with his presentations, take us away with all of his presentation, couple of housekeeping notes. Please make sure that you are catching this live stream on our Facebook page, C3EB Summit, or our YouTube channel, C3EB Summit. You will be able to comment, and we will be able to engage with you real time with your comments. So we want to keep it as interactive as possible. So please comment, let us know you're here so that we can keep this as engaging as possible. And also make sure you subscribe for future content, and make sure you go to the C3EB Summit Facebook page, like us, and give us a rating so that all of us and our speakers can use this feedback to improve our services to you and our content to you in the future. So your feedback is much appreciated. And if you love it, that's awesome. Secondly, this summit would not be possible without the generous support and help from our sponsors and our partners who are walking this walk with us toward equity, belongingness, and intentional inclusion. So I just want to say a huge thank you to Essential IT, our web team, Defy the Status Quo Marketing, Zanzibar Enterprises, and the Nielsen Company. That being said, it is my absolute honor to bring to the C3EB Summit platform our current workshop presenter and expert speaker, Joseph T. Hare. Hi, Joseph. So for for those who don't know Joseph Hare, Joseph is the founder, president, and senior consultant at Hare Holdings, LLC, an operational and organizational development expert, independent holistic ministerial evangelist, and seasoned manager with over 25 years of leadership. Joseph Hare has made advancing the vital needs of organizations and individuals his vocation and avocation. Motivated by an inner spirit, the personal mantra is the sovereignty of man is found in his self-denying service to his fellow man. Whether working alone or as a part of a high-performance team, Joseph has added to the advancement of people, processes, and profit of not-for-profit and for-profit organizations with as few as 60 employees to as many as 340,000 across varied industries. As a man of many talents and areas of expertise, Joseph has started 3 companies, earned 4 advanced degrees, achieved international scholastic recognition, provides ministerial support for churches across 4 states, advocates for at-risk people of all demographics, and single-handedly raised 2 sons. Whew, I have goosebumps. Joseph balances his busy professional life with varied hobbies and social interests, including playing tennis, basketball, air hockey, reading, life coaching, facilitating, business networking, leading group discussions, teaching Bible classes, fine dining, and theater outings with friends and family. Joseph is a passionate communicator and public speaker who believes the most sublime way to show one's appreciation for knowledge manifests in sharing it with the open-hearted. Man, that was so powerful. So everybody watching this, whether you're watching this live or later, you know what you're in for over the next 45 minutes. So with that being said, I'm going to hand off the stage to Joseph T. Hare, our expert presenter for this workshop. Take it away,
AJ, I am so appreciative that you have entrusted this time to a humble gentleman like me, who just finds great pleasure in sharing what I've been fortunate to receive with whomever I can. And I tell you, what better way than to be a part of the Culturally Competent Conversation for Equity and Belonging workshop here with this amazing organization and wonderful servants like yourself. So AJ, thank you for allowing me this privilege, and welcome to all of you who are sharing in what we're going to experience today. And I did want to say, as I listened to all that you read, I thought, now, wow, how have I been able to do all that? That's a lot. But I'm grateful that every day I get up, I push it to the max, and I always make sure I remember that I'm not just doing it for other people, but I'm doing it for a greater power, and that power is the one that keeps me going. So I'm so thankful for this opportunity to share a little bit of what I've been able to glean and benefit and gain over my years of learning and serving. So thank you again, AJ, and welcome all of you to this experience, and thank you for sharing your time. And I believe that you will be enriched today. If it's okay, I want to start off before I actually initiate my presentation with a thought that encouraged me this morning. I have been in ministry for 33 years, so forgive me if for bringing in the word, but I have to just share this thought with you. It seemed to be relevant for what we're going to talk about today. Psalms 82, verses 3 and 4, it says, "Defend the weak and the fatherless, uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed, rescue the weak and the needy, deliver them from the hand of the wicked." And while we are not necessarily designating any one particular person as wicked in this conversation, but I do want to get the point that there's a need for advocacy. There's a need for us to be aware of the downtrodden and those who have special circumstances, those who have special needs, those who may be facing challenges that they just don't know exactly how to handle. That kind of advocacy is a large part of why I've been doing what I've been doing for the last 33 years and why I'm taking it as a privilege to be sharing with you today. So I want to jump right in and give you my official welcome to today's culturally competent conversation for equity belongingness workshop. Today we're talking about the vulnerability of diversity and inclusion to subjectivity. Now, those all sound like very interesting words. And over the last 20 years, in the arena of business and people engagement, companies have had to make sure that they rightly understand how vulnerability, how diversity, how inclusion, how all that works together to make sure human beings are being represented as equitable, valuable, priority across their organization. And individuals like myself and organizations that AJ is associated with, we all come together to help individuals, not just the company, but also the employee, to understand how vulnerability, diversity, inclusion, and I'm going to throw in there equity works together. But today we're going to look at how all of this can be so vulnerable to subjectivity. And so I'm going to believe that by the time we get through with this, we're going to appreciate the simplicity, but the importance of what we're addressing today. So let's move on to first understanding how we're going to approach this. So a very, very major economic and academic hero of mine, Albert Einstein, he has a lot of things that I've appreciated about catchy slogans, but this is the one that seemed to stand out when I was thinking about our presentation. If you can't explain it simply, Einstein says, you don't understand it well enough. And I want us to carry that as a backdrop to the way I'm going to be presenting information here. My goal is to make sure that when we understand the vulnerability of diversity and inclusion to subjectivity, that we're going to get the basic fundamentals of what exactly those words are talking about and what we're supposed to be getting as our takeaway today so that we can rightly understand and then we can rightly share and explain what it is that has to be understood about inclusion, diversity, and equity. So let's move on with the thought in mind. And thank you, Albert Einstein, for contributing to our conversation today. The vulnerability of diversity, inclusion, and subjectivity. What is this all about? So we're going to get into the denotative understanding of vulnerability, diversity, subjectivity, and inclusion. Then we're going to jump into determining how we can make sure that we are aware of these particular aspects and why it is that we have to be aware of what it is we're dealing with when we're talking about these areas. And then we're going to look at how we can directly apply and see if there are some scenarios where we may be missing opportunity to apply these aspects. And then we're going to begin to understand how we can dissect whether or not we're being successful. We're going to dissect results. We're going to talk about how results can be dissected and general ideas on how we can assess our success or not of rightly engaging diversity, inclusion, and making sure that we're not over creating vulnerable spaces because of the role of the subjectivity that these ideas have to our perspective. Just continue to follow me and we're going to make all this make sense here as we move on. So let's begin first with the denotative understanding. Vulnerability is the quality or state of being exposed to the possibility of being attacked or harmed, either physically or emotionally. Diversity is the practice or quality of including or involving people from a range of different social and ethnic backgrounds and of different genders, sexual orientations. Inclusion means the practice or policy of providing equal access to opportunities and resources for people who might otherwise be excluded or marginalized, such as those who have physical or mental disabilities and members of other minority groups. And lastly, the idea of subjectivity is where the quality of being based on or influenced by personal feelings, tastes, or opinions. I want to reemphasize subjectivity again because that word is the most vital part of this conversation. The quality of being based on or influenced by personal feelings, tastes, or opinions. A lot of us understand what it means to not like the way someone may perceive us, how someone may think about us. But when we understand the role of subjectivity, it is important for us to know that every aspect of the human life has many dimensions of it that are subject to our personal feelings, our personal appetites, our personal opinions, our personal tastes. Some things taste good to one person, they may not taste good to another. One situation may make one person feel happy, and that same situation can make someone else feel displaced. Those ideas fall under the notion of subjectivity. So then we consider how can vulnerability, diversity, and inclusion become a space that is subject to someone's personal feelings, someone's tastes, someone's opinions. And that's where we're going to dig in because it's so important for us to understand that how we feel, our opinions, our tastes in certain things, whether if it's a way a person dresses, how a person conducts themselves, how a person pursues certain values of life, we have to be able to recognize that those aspects of our personal feelings, our opinions, can spill over in the way that we pursue inclusion, diversity. And there's a space of vulnerability that we have to guard so that when we're approaching the goal of diversity and inclusion, that we're not making them subject to our personal feelings, our personal tastes, and our opinions. So let's move forward and see how we can unpack this. So now we're looking at how we can pursue, once we get the denotative understanding of this, to determine how it is our awareness comes about. So let's be completely honest on one's unique needs. This is where we can launch our ability to make sure that we are aware of what it is that has to be a part of a successful approach to diversity and inclusion. The person who needs some type of diverse accommodation, the person who needs some type of unique inclusion must make sure that he or she or that individual is being completely honest on what one's needs really are. We have to make sure that we don't misrepresent as a person who has some particular special circumstance that may make us vulnerable to the efforts for diversity and inclusion? Are we the person who may require a special accommodation, making sure that we are being completely upfront and honest about what our individual unique need is to that employer? So then we have self-actualize our hangups. This points to the person in the position to influence your or my need for specific diverse initiatives, inclusion initiatives. If I am the employer and I understand your particular need, am I making sure that I'm aware if I personally have any hangups, any dispositions, any personal feelings about whatever your particular need might be? Because if I don't make sure that I'm aware of my own personal hangups, then I will allow those dispositions to come into play when I'm thinking about whether I want to provide spaces of inclusion and opportunities for diversity that would make you welcome within your space of unique need. And so we now look at separating fact from fable when learning different human traits. Once I actualize whether or not my personal feelings are being in any way an influence on how I pursue creating inclusion and diversity for those individuals who are under my influences, I need to make sure that I understand the facts about those particular unique needs. Some individuals may have needs that I think I understand, but I haven't really made sure that what I understand is based on fact, or maybe is it based on something that is popular but still may not be true about that particular person's unique need. A lot of us carry thoughts in our mind that we call facts, when in fact, they're not facts. They are not based on true information that specifically speaks to some particular trait that is unique in a person. Then we stick to with what the company, point number 4, let's make sure we're sticking with company lingo and not our own. I thought that was important because when we think about inclusion and diversity, we need to make sure that we're understanding how the company has presented its understanding of what diversity is and how diversity works, what inclusion is and how inclusion works. Because if I, as an example, am a hiring manager per se, that means I'm the person who is actually needing to increase my staff. So I've asked for someone to be added to my team. So let's say the company pursues a candidate for my particular position that I'm looking to fill, and that candidate has a specific need. Maybe it could be some type of accommodation that they need. I have to make sure that I understand how the company has presented its position on how accommodation works for that individual. It's not up to me to invent or create ideas for myself if I'm working for a company. Even if I own my own company, I need to have already established how diversity works within my company, how inclusion works in my company. And I have to stick with that regardless of the circumstance of need that has to be accommodated. It's very important when individuals are attempting to make sure that diversity and inclusion are not vulnerable to my own subjectivity in the way that I think and the way that I feel. I cannot apply that from person to person if I have a company established policy and understanding of what diversity and inclusion means. That allows there to be a continuity of how the company treats employees with different types of needs or different types of accommodations. I have to make sure that we're not, and I'm not, changing how that looks, changing how that feels with each person. I have to make sure that I'm being consistent with the way that I applied diversity, inclusion, and these concepts that are applied in our operation in the way the company has already established it. So it's very important. Just one book that the employee, we're going to go right back and refresh these 4 points just real quick before we move to the next slide. Be completely honest on one's unique needs. That means when you are the person who may have something that's unique that requires accommodation, make sure you're completely honest about whatever your unique need may be. Self-actualize your hangups. That's for the person who's actually attempting to serve or lead or employ that person who may have an accommodated need. Make sure that you don't have your personal hangups that are coming into play and influencing how you fairly and equitably pursue making that person acceptable, accepting, and accommodated in that particular workspace. Separate fact from fable when learning different human traits. So make sure that we know what we're talking about, not in our own mind, but how the industry has presented its interpretation on what a particular need may be. Not based on a fable or some made up concept that may be popular, but what is the fact about this need? What is the fact about this trait? And what is it that could be best done to accommodate it? And then stick with company lingo and not your own. Making sure that the way you pursue accommodating diversity, inclusion, is within the paradigm that has been pre-established by your company. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So we've got identitative understanding, we got determined awareness. Now we're talking about direct application and how we can apply these things directly. Point one, be upfront with limitations for your accommodations. There are times where a person may have a need and they minimize the impact that they know that special need is going to have in order for them to do their job. Oftentimes they will not be completely clear on what their full need is because they're concerned that maybe they won't get hired. Maybe the person interviewing them may seem like that they're a little bit too complicated to manage. And so they may, quote unquote, water down or perhaps just completely misrepresent all of what their special need and places upon them as a limitation. There's examples that could be given. I had an experience with a gentleman who was wheelchair bound at one company I was working at. He had to stay in his wheelchair. He had certain accommodations where his wheelchair, he had to have a chance to do these special exercises. I'll just say it that way. He was required by his medical provider to do a few special exercises to make sure that because of the time he spends in his chair, that he's able to have that lower body circulation. So every now and then he had to skip away, take a couple minutes, do what he had to do, and come back. And I'm going to stay on this. I know my presentation looks like it's going ahead of me, but I'm going to continue with this point and we'll catch up. So with this scenario, the gentleman would not necessarily explain, he didn't explain really, how often he really was supposed to do this. How often he was going to need to go away. We would even look at some of the medical information we were given, and it wasn't completely clear on how often he'd have to be away. So it was maybe once every 2 or 3 hours, but he really needed to go every hour in order to rightly allow the exercising that he needed. But he didn't mention that. And I'm going on, so just continue to follow me. We'll catch up on my slide here. So in the scenario, the person did not explain that I really need to just step away every hour in order to make sure that I'm having optimal health with the circumstances that I'm in. So by him saying that after the fact, we begin to have different experiences because of his need to always leave every hour when the other people on his team were not expecting him to be away that much. So we ended up having to address some of the concerns from his coworkers about him leaving so much because of the absence of his ability to contribute. So as you can see, had it been known up front that this particular individual needed to go at least once every hour, we would have better been able to prepare him and those who work with him for that special accommodation without getting into so much about his personal condition. And so it's always good, and I'm making sure I put this out there, be upfront with limitations for accommodations, whatever they may be as thorough as you can and provide as much documentation as you can if it's medically related to make sure that you're being able to get a full accommodation to the extent that you need and that the company can determine the best path to giving you full accommodation. Now let's flip to balloon number 2 there. Use the same scale when weighing cost and benefit. Now, this is for the individual company that is accommodating an individual. Use the same scale when weighing cost and benefit. Oftentimes, when organizations are determining their budgets for human resource staffing, typically project managers or HR managers like myself, one of my master's degrees is specializes in human resource management with organizational management. When we design staff planograms and we begin to determine staffing levels and then we establish budgets for those, there's a certain amount of value that we attach dollar value to each position, not the person, to the position, so that we can be fair and equitable for all variations within a position. So that if we hire 10 people in one position, the budget we have for every person is the same. So if we begin to look at that as a cost, then we begin to identify how are we going to gain benefit from what we're expending for that person. So let's say we have an individual who has a special need or some particular accommodation. It may cost us a little bit more to accommodate that person's need than it is for the other people who may work in that same type of position. So we look at our budget that has been allocated for that position, and we attempt to determine before we hire this person, are we going to be able to see ourselves achieving the benefit from hiring that person in comparison to the cost it's going to take for us to maintain that person, whether if it's a special type of environment they need to be in, whether if it's a special type of tools that they need for that person that is unique for that person. That means we have to think about the added cost for hiring that person and accommodating that person. But if we are saying that we're going to look at the cost for hiring that person with every little detail that we try to determine so we can make it seem like it's so expensive if we hire that person, but then we don't take that same effort to look to see how we can actualize that person into their workspace so that we can optimize the return that we get or the benefit that we get from employing that person. So if we are very micro in the way that we look at the cost for employing and accommodating that person, then we need to be as crafty and strategic and micro in the way that we creative design opportunity for that person to be a contributor to our environment so we can get that balance of cost and benefit. But sometimes leaders don't put that kind of effort. We start thinking about all the extra that it will take for us to be able to accommodate this person. But we don't really put that same energy in saying, yes, but if we do this and if we do that, we can actually still gain quite a bit from employing that person. So if we don't use the same approach or the same scale when we're determining how much of a cost impact it will be for us to accommodate this person, we need to be sure that we're putting that same effort and creative thinking and strategy and finding that healthy space to get benefit from hiring this person. Because after all, unless you're just in the business of giving away money, you have to be able to offset your costs. So it is necessary to weigh costs successfully when you're looking at unexpected or unanticipated degrees of accommodation. But in order for us to make sure they're optimizing diversity and inclusion, we can't haphazardly treat that special need. And if we are haphazard about it, that's when that person's need is vulnerable to the subject nature of our power in that scenario. So at that point, you see the vulnerability of that person's diversity and inclusion to the subjectivity of my effort or not to rightly assess cost and benefit. So for the person seeking the job, they're hoping that we will see as the employing person that there is a lot that person can contribute and not just look at their special need, whatever it may be, as a cost addition, but also to see the benefit. And there's some subjectivity that makes those attributes of need vulnerable if we're not careful with being equal in the way we weigh out the cost and benefit of accommodation in each scenario. Balloon number 3 says, hold each side accountable. Now, this is once we are able to establish an employee-employer relationship. We have a special need. We've created a method that we're going to use to include that person. We have accommodations that we've put in paper to make sure that that person understands as an employee what to expect as an accommodation for their special need. At that point, we need to make sure that each side is fulfilling what it is that they agreed to. Don't allow your special accommodation to go unaccommodated. I'm going to say that again. It's very important if we are a person who has some type of special accommodation, make sure that our employer is actually fulfilling the accommodations that were said. If you're supposed to have a special parking spot, as an example, and you come in on Monday and you're looking and you don't see it, don't just shrug your shoulders and say, well, I don't want to create a stir. I'll just find another spot and just kind of deal with this accommodation that has not been made yet. Maybe they need a little more time to not have this accommodation. Maybe it will come in a day or two. Okay, that sounds fair. But the first time you do not have an accommodation provided, make sure it's communicated. Hold that person accountable, because in the process of creating accommodative strategy, it's easy for some one element to accidentally be overlooked. Let's say there were 3 or 4 accommodations that may have to have been made, but somehow maybe one, using that parking space as an example, maybe they forgot, oh yeah, I didn't put that sign out there, but you're already there, it's too late. But you can still let them know, I wasn't able to find my parking spot, and give that employer the opportunity to make that accommodation and to let them know that you do mean that you desire that accommodation. It's important to you. You make sure you hold equity, value in the accommodations that you asked for, so that you can know that inclusion and diversity is comfortably and happily applied for your special circumstance, whatever it may be. Don't brush it off. Don't let it slide. When it first happens, don't get upset. Just bring it to the person, and this is how you hold them accountable. But let's imagine you have the other side of the equation. You have an individual who says, because of my special need, I may have to come to work 20 minutes late every day. Is that going to be okay? Well, once we understand that need and we recognize that it is something legitimate, we will say, oh, okay, no problem. Is 20 minutes all you need? Are you sure? Oh, absolutely. 20 minutes is completely enough. Well, we have an agreement. 20 minutes is going to be accommodated to you, all of your coworkers, all of your managers, everybody who depends on you understands that Joseph is going to come in 20 minutes late every day, but he has accommodated on the end and through the day to make those 20 minutes up, so it's fine. And then Joseph shows up 40 minutes late, 35 minutes late, 25 minutes late, 35 minutes late. The first time Joseph is beyond 20 minutes, which was clearly explained, comfortably negotiated, and consistently and assuredly accommodated, but yet here's Joseph operating outside of that 20 minutes. The employer has to approach that employee, and if you're the employer, make sure you address it at the very first time it happens. You're not being overboard, you're not being threatening, you're not trying to be overly confrontational, but you do have to bring it to Joseph's attention. Joseph, thanks for coming in. Can I talk to you for a second? Listen, it's about 35 after. Are you okay? Well, we agreed 20 minutes. All of the team is working around that 20 minutes. And anything beyond that is very complicated for us because the entire operation, we all depend on you. And Joseph has to be held accountable for what Joseph agreed to when he said 20 minutes for that accommodation. Inclusion at that point cannot be subject to Joseph's desires to take upon himself to make flexibility fit his definition. So I, as the employee who's being accommodated, I cannot make that accommodation subject to my own whims. I can't just say, well, they've said 20 minutes, it should be okay if I'm 30. I'm making the company's needs subject to my own feelings of self accommodation. That is not how diversity and inclusion is successful when we're talking about protecting diversity and inclusion from subjectivity. The company cannot be punished for trying to accommodate you. Or let's say I was using myself in that example. So if I'm saying that I'm going to make the company's efforts to accommodate me to be subject to my feelings and views, then I'm going to create an unsustainable, unsuccessful experience of inclusion and diversity. And I have to be careful of that. So both the employer and the employee needs to make sure that when accommodations are put in paper, they're agreed upon, that we hold each other accountable and we fulfill those. And then this last bubble is add accommodations where possible. My fourth balloon there. Hoping you've liked the diversity of colors that I've attempted to add to just make the point something physical we can see. I've added different colors here on each slide. I hope you picked that up. But here on the fourth balloon, add accommodations where possible. Now, there are times that we may have an agreement, employer, the employee, and we have been able to make a way where a special accommodation has been put in place. And then we begin to realize that even though the person being accommodated was very negotiable and agreeable in how it was that I or the employer was going to approach accommodating some special need. But sometimes the company may feel, well, I'm not sure if I can really accommodate you in that way and it be sustainable, but can I accommodate you in this way? Will that be okay? Will that work for you? And maybe that employee who has the need may think about it and say, well, I'll work with that. I think we can work with that. It's not everything that would make my need facilitated, but if that's what you'll do to meet me halfway, I'd be happy to. But what would happen if we found that employee-employee relationship working very well, and that me as the employer begin to say, you know what, I'm realizing that we really can do that extra thing for that person because the impact that we were thinking accommodating was going to have, it really hasn't. So we as the employer, just because we've made an accommodation doesn't mean we should exclude our thinking to always letting that person know who needs that special accommodation that we're thinking about them, that their special needs are important to us. We care. And so if we go in and say, listen, Bob or Jill, we were doing this for you to accommodate, but when you mentioned when we first started on this that there was something else that you really would appreciate, we as a company are realizing that we have been able to find a way to do that. So we want to go ahead and expand our accommodations for you, that you will be able to have the full benefit that you need and the special accommodation that you were asking for. But we want you to know that we appreciate that you were willing to work with us. But we have been able to identify added accommodations that we can do for you within the space that you had originally asked before we made this agreement. So we're going to expand on the accommodation for you, and this is what it is we're going to do for you. And we appreciate you as a part of our team, as a part of our company. That adds value, that elevates, that motivates, that does so much for that employee. And it also teaches employers to always look for a way to add value to their employees overall. And that's the beautiful thing about accommodation for people who have special circumstances or attempting to build optimal, diverse, and inclusive environments. It helps the employer add value to the way they view their employees. Human resources, human elements within a business are a very large part of an organization. Most every organization is very in need of great, motivated, balanced, consistent employees. So it helps the employer when they're always looking for ways to expand on the value or the way that they show value for their employees to be able to do those things. And sometimes added accommodations is one way. Okay, now let's move from direct application onto our fourth area of consideration. So we've got denotative understanding. We looked at what these words were meaning, and vulnerability, diversity, inclusion, and subjectivity. We've determined our awareness and how our need to be aware can impact this. We also looked at some direct applications of how we take our denotative understanding and our ability to be aware of ourselves, and we apply it to our day-to-day actions. Now let's look at dissecting results. How we look at whether or not our effort to make diversity and inclusion protected from any degree of subjectivity, we now are looking at how can we make sure that this is a successful experience. So point one is let the margins be the sole measure. And here's what that means. We're talking about margins. We're talking about what you gain once you put out the cost for all of your diversity programs, your inclusion programs, what it is you're expending to make sure that you're being very consistent and vibrant in having a diverse and inclusive environment. Now we're looking at, but how did we gain economically from that? What was the added value to our company after we invested what we did into all of our programs and our efforts and our initiatives and our accommodations? Now let's make sure we're rightly looking at how we've benefited financially. We cannot just look at the areas that may be around how their coworkers feel, because sometimes coworkers and their viewpoints or their positions, we listen to them, but we can't let maybe some coworker or a couple of employees be the ones that influences how we determine our success. We have to just let the dollars speak, because at the end of the day, we hire people, we accommodate people, we include people because we want people to contribute to our business success. So if we're being successful in all aspects of our economic margins, and I guarantee you, economic margins are influenced by employee morale, employee retention. So all of these factors would have already been in place once we quantified cost over benefit, revenue over income, net income. So those are the margins. And when we look at whether we're progressing as a business financially, then we know that we are being successful. And again, margins for any company would have already been influenced by high turnover, the lawsuits, complaints. All of these things would have already impacted the value that we're getting out of our programs. So if the margins are where we need them to be, that means we've been successful with our retention. We've been successful with handling any disputes. We've been successful with anything that may have come as a result of our efforts to add accommodations to make sure we have a diverse and inclusive environment. All of that would have already had an impact. So when we quantify all of that and we see that we're still being financially successful, then that should be what keeps encouraging and motivating us to maintain our programs, and then encourage us to make sure that we retain control over any degree of subjectivity that could come into place in our efforts to have a diverse and inclusive environment.
Then we have balloon number 2. Make sure accommodations are sustainable. Now, even if we have had success, we have to then begin to think, what did really we do to gain the success? If it was a lot of stress, if it was a lot of confrontation, if it was a lot of changes that were made throughout the whole time that we were looking at our measured period. A lot of times we look at academic year, a calendar year for some. Then we have fiscal years for other companies. They look at that period of time. Maybe they can look at that 1 quarter, or maybe every other quarter, or maybe they just do it once a year to see how they're doing overall financially. Let's say that what it costs for them, the effort that they had to put in to maintain a successful environment, was really a whole lot more than they could see themselves sustaining. So then it's important for the company to look at what they really had to do to maintain the margins that they were able to achieve that we just spoke about with balloon number 1. Let's say that we made a good profit, but we still put so much energy, so much effort to make that happen. We have to ask ourselves, are we sure our programs, our diverse initiatives, our inclusive initiatives, the way that we accommodate everyone in our team, is this something we can see ourselves continuously doing? So even if you have success, the question becomes, is that success sustainable? Because in so many aspects of business, especially when it comes down to the human resource element, there are times that we can be successful for a period, but it's just not something that we can comfortably see sustaining. And we have to go back and revisit our approaches to achieving what we're attempting to have a diverse and inclusive environment. And we've got to make sure that we're being fair and equitable in the way that we build programs around our employees so that we can make sure that they can expect a continuation and a sustainable relationship that we have. And we won't find ourselves having to lay off or fire people or shift people around just because our programs to accommodate, to create inclusion, were not planned well enough to the point where they're sustainable. So let's make sure that when you're dissecting the results of your diversity and your inclusion programs, that they're sustainable over time based upon what you had to input to make it happen. Okay, and then align policy with best practice. Once we find as a company that we've been able to establish sustainable programs for inclusion and diversity, and that we're protecting them from any degree of vulnerability, and that we're getting our margins where they need to be, sometimes we have to look at, okay, let's make sure that what we have as a common practice for our company has been augmented in a way that anyone who comes in will be able to read and understand what we have been able to achieve and what we intend to continue as our approach to vulnerability, to controlling vulnerability of diversity and inclusion to any degree of subjectivity. Putting it in policy form helps make sure that there is no change in the way this is approached so that we can have sustainability. Let's say I hire a manager. It's my company. I hire a new manager. We've had a successful program of diversity and inclusion. Everybody who has special accommodations has been going wonderful, but I haven't put everything in writing as a policy. So I hire a new manager. He comes in. He steps into a space that was already operating. Maybe we promoted another manager, so we brought a new person in. That person looks at the policies, the operating procedures, the manuals. Maybe if it's a union environment, they look at all of the agreements. We look at all the special things that we have done. They're trying to make sure that they acclimate themselves with what's expected of the employees, the operation, and themselves. But if there's something that has not been put in policy form or in writing, sometimes we call them memorandums of understanding in a lot of our union environments. That's a common terminology. We have these in place so that there will be a continuation of understanding, so that when someone comes in, the operation is not subject to that person's views or feelings, but they will be able to come in and just take on the existing culture and understand the policies and the principles and the practices that drive that culture. So it makes it necessary to be sure that once we have these accommodations and all of this is sustainable success in place, that we make them in line with our policies. We change policies even if necessary to make sure that they reflect the results of all that we've done to achieve success in our efforts to create diversity and inclusion in our workspace. Okay, so we're going to move on to our overview real quick of what we looked at. We covered the denotative understandings of what vulnerability, diversity, inclusion, and subjectivity really are. We determined our awareness on what it is that we can do to make sure that we don't have our own opinions and feelings that are overriding what it is that the company desires in our efforts to pursue diversity and inclusion. We made direct application. We looked at different ways that we can make sure that diversity and inclusion are not being subject to our efforts to minimize personal feelings, personal views, or anything subject to our own personal view. And then we looked at dissecting the results, how we can go about dissecting the results. And so with that, I thank you so much for sharing this time. And we, with any time we have remaining, can take any questions that we may have.
Thank you so much for that, Joseph. We are actually running a little overtime, but I wanted to thank you so much for being here and presenting that. The importance of communication in these types of discussions is now very obvious to me, at least I hope to everyone else who watched it. So thank you so much again for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, everyone.
And I'd like to thank all of our sponsors, and please go ahead and move on to another session. We have plenty of things for you to watch. And yes, and any comments, shares, or likes that you can give us will help us continue this summit and for future summits. Thank you so much, everyone.